native Ant-Mimicking spider, Myrmarachne formicaria.
Okay.
15 minutes.
Just
We can see the
okay.
presentation.
All right. My name is Jenny Apple, and I'm from SUNY Geneseo, and I'm going to be talking about the natural history of this ant-mimicking spider. And I first want to acknowledge the undergraduate researchers who are listed here and contributed data to this study. Okay, so the ant-mimicking spider that I study is found in is the family Salticidae. Its body shape, as shown on the right, is very different than the typical members of the Salticidae, the jumping spiders. It has a much more elongate body shape, different coloration, much less hairy than your typical salticid spider. The species that we're studying is one of 200 species in its genus, all of which are ant mimics. It's native to Europe and Asia, and it's a recent arrival to North America, first reported in Ohio in 2001 by Bradley, Cutler, and Hodge. And it's sexually dimorphic. The males have these very elongated chelicerae that make them very distinctive. These ant-mimicking spiders not only look like ants, but they also behave like ants. And so I want to show you a little video that shows you how they mimic the locomotion of ants. You can see how they wave their first pair of legs as if they're antennae, so they look a little more like they're moving around on 6 legs rather than 8 legs. There's not a lot known about Myrmarachne formicaria in its native range. There's only a handful of published studies that focus on this species. One study from the Czech Republic investigated its chemical resemblance to one of the putative models, Formica rufibarbus ant, although other ant species have been proposed as potential models for this mimic, such as other Formica. The Myrmica rubra European fire ant has also been proposed. It has a general resemblance to lots of different ant species. This map is showing how it is spreading throughout Northeast North America based on iNaturalist records, first starting in Ohio and the Buffalo area of New York, further into Ontario and New York, appearing in Pennsylvania more recently. And just last summer, there are sightings over in Chicago and Vermont. And this summer, there was also a sighting up in near Montreal. So it is steadily spreading throughout Northeast North America. I first became acquainted with the spider probably about 10 years ago. I'm only recently come to studying spiders. I've studied insects for most of my career, especially ants. And in this field site on our campus, I've been monitoring these mound nesting Formica ant colonies that are regularly rated by this dulotic ant, Formica subintegra. And in these observations, I would occasionally come across these ant-mimicking spiders near the nest or among the ants. And then I started noticing that they were building their silken shelters on flags that I used to mark their ant nest, the ant nest that I was observing. There's not a lot known about how it uses natural habitats in its invaded range. The original reported sightings of this species were mainly in peri-domestic settings, like people's houses, near buildings. You can see a lot of the iNaturalist observations are not in very natural settings. So the goal of my research in my lab has been to characterize the natural history of Myrmarachne formicaria in its invaded range, including documenting patterns in space, like the degree of association with ants, whether it has any particular habitat preferences, documenting patterns in time, like the phenology of appearance of males and females and their reproductive activity. Also, my students have been working on studying their behavior. Males exhibit very, very interesting display behavior, and also how they behave in interactions with potential enemies. And finally, we're also assessing their genetic variation in their invaded range. Because these spiders seem to have affinity for these pin flags, I've been using them as a way to survey sites for their presence, setting up grids of 12 flags in 18 plots in 4 different locations. I've been checking these plots weekly throughout the summers of 2019 and 2020 to document the presence of the ant-mimicking spiders. In summer 2019, I also sampled these grids for ants using both pitfall traps and grids of cookie baits. So the first question I'll address is whether or not ant-mimicking spiders are more common in sites with more ants. And this top bar plot over here is showing patterns of the incidence of observations of ant-mimicking spiders in my 18 different sites. So these aren't the number of spiders, but the number of times I've cited spiders over the course of my surveys, my weekly surveys. And you can see this top graph doesn't really resemble the ant abundance data from pitfall traps or baits in the lower two panels. And indeed, there's no significant correlation. Although I could take a deeper dive into these data to look more at whether there's particular species that they might significantly associate with. There could be a lot more done with these data. You can also see that there is a habitat preference. These different bars are color-coded by habitat type, from younger forest to field to older forest in blue. And you can see the orange and white bars are generally have more ant-mimicking spiders than the blue bars representing the older forest with a more closed canopy and less developed understory. So they tend to prefer these younger forest and field sites more than the older forest sites. And this same pattern was observed in both years of surveys. I've also been curious about what natural substrates use for shelters, because clearly they do not use vinyl flags in their native range. And I've been able to find them on like curled up leaves, rolled up leaves in the understory, leaf litter, and even in snail shells on the forest floor. So those are some of the natural substrates they will use. So these graphs are showing variation in the abundance of the ant-mimicking adults over the season. With my 2019 survey here, my 2020 survey here. In 2020, I started the survey 3 weeks earlier, but there really wasn't much more going on during those 3 weeks. You can see that females are consistently occupying these silken shelters throughout the summer, while males are much more shifted towards the latter half of the summer. You don't see them on the flags in shelters, although you do see them around. They're just not necessarily using these shelters on the flags. These graphs are showing the phenology of the immature stages, both in 2019 and 2020, with similar patterns. Eggs generally start to appear in early June, and spiderlings are hatching by early July, followed by a peak in juveniles. Females are very attentive to their egg masses and spiderlings and are faithful to these shelters week after week in my surveys. This peak that we see in males later in the summer seems to come right after the peak in the juveniles. And by this time of the season, you often find males in shelters on the same flags as juveniles, as you see here, perhaps awaiting mating opportunities when those juveniles mature. Sometimes you will find multiple males on the same flag, and this will lead to interesting display behavior, which I'm going to show in this next video. When two males encounter each other. You can see when they first see each other, we have a little bit of mirroring movement back and forth. And then it will escalate a bit with the males snapping open those enlarged chelicerae, displaying them to each other. And eventually, often one will retreat. So presumably these have a role in securing territory or access to females. I had a student simulate these interactions in the lab and look at what factors affect the outcome of these encounters between two males. And body size appears to be important, with larger males generally standing their ground and younger, smaller males retreating. There actually is quite a bit of body size variation in these natural populations. So you might wonder why these spiders do resemble ants. And it's generally thought that ant-mimicking spiders are exhibiting a form of Batesian mimicry, where a palatable species will mimic a distasteful or harmful species in order to avoid predation. And ants tend to not. Ants tend not to taste very good. They often can be aggressive, able to sting or bite or attack en masse. And so it's generally maybe a wise idea to avoid them. So my students, Naomi Van Alstyne and Julia Offels, presented a poster that elaborated on these experiments that they did, comparing outcomes of encounters between this ant mimic and potential predators in their environment. We used the very common Phidippus princeps and compared outcomes of encounters between these two encounters between the predator and another salticid spider that was a non-mimic. And you can see here that ant mimics were much less likely to be attacked in these trials than the non-mimic salticids. We are also assessing genetic variation in the invaded range. And in summer 2019, I sampled this spider from 14 locations in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And sampling for the spider might be a little bit different than you might sample for other spiders. I found it's easiest to find it in kind of anthropogenic settings where there's little crevices for it to build its shelter, like these pots at a nature center. Along this wall of this shed, they were crawling up the walls and perhaps nesting just at the edge of the shed. So there's some examples of our collecting sites. My students, Cassidy Mills and Daniel Fleischman, who also presented a poster yesterday, sequenced a part of a mitochondrial gene in 27 samples, a gene that has shown interspecific variation in other spiders, but they found very little genetic variation. Only 2 individuals showed any polymorphism among the 27 at 2 different sites. So this suggests that this introduction might just be a single introduction event from a single site in Europe and a relatively recent event. Of course, we do need to do more sampling, more broader geographic sampling. So you also might wonder about the ecological impact of this spider. Does it pose a threat to any native fauna? We do have native ant-mimicking spiders in the northeastern United States. One that I encounter often, well, not occasionally in my surveys, is Cinnamosina formica, which is a very delicate ant mimic, much more cryptic in its habits than the introduced spiders. So whether it's having any effect on these, I don't know, or on the invertebrate fauna in general. But Myrmarachne formicaria certainly presents a unique opportunity to study a species early in its colonization of a new environment, in the context of potentially novel associations and habitats, as it encounters a new, different ant fauna and different habitats than it might have occupied in its native range. So I want to thank some individuals for spider care help, Allison Menendez and Jeff Over, collection of spiders by Jeff Over and Ed Beery, our Geneseo Foundation for funding, and also the AAS 2021 conference organizers for setting up this wonderful meeting. And I'm happy to entertain any questions if there's time.
Great talk, Jenny. Thank you. We have time only for one question. Mike Trini say, do the male chelicera display positive allometry? Well, grow much faster than the rest of the body?
I don't know. I haven't looked at that kind of morphological variation. It would be interesting. We do see a lot of morphological variation in size, and I haven't tried to measure relative chelicerae to body length yet. But it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. There are another question in the chat if you want to answer later.
Okay,
we have to move on.